Well, hi and welcome. I am your hostess, Crystal Morris Murphy, and welcome to the OSG video blog. Today, we're celebrating Earth Day and National Park Week with three esteemed guests from the preservation and conservation sector. And today's conversation will be focused on strategic partnerships and how they add value to the work of my guests doing this every day to protect the earth and the outdoors. We're also going to highlight as well some big news coming from former and current US presidents. I mean, it's been a busy week for them last week. So we're excited to get started. And before we get into the heavy meat of the conversation, I'd love for my guests to introduce themselves. Tell us who you are, what organization you're representing, and what drew you to this work. So what's your story? Any one of you can go. Jeannie?
Great, I'll go first. So I'm Jeannie Braha. I'm the executive director of Rock Creek Conservancy. We're the Friends group to Rock Creek Park in Northwest Washington, D.C. We also protect the entire Rock Creek watershed in D.C. and Montgomery County, Maryland. What I love watersheds and I love parks, and this job lets me put those two things together, doing public lands protection and really connecting people to the places that they love to create long-term stewardship. So that's why I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeannie. Raina?
Yeah, I'm Raina Payan. I'm the Director of Grant Making for Justice Outside. I'm calling in from the ancestral homelands of the Yokut tribes of the San Joaquin Valley, what is now known as Merced, California. And I started this work very accidentally. I took a summer camp job many years ago, if I can date myself, and I fell in love with it. I had never seen anything like it, and I noticed that there weren't a whole lot of people that look like me. Teaching summer camp, teaching outdoor education, which is where my career moved. And as I've continued my career, really emphasizing the importance of engagement with communities of color as critical stakeholders in the preservation of the planet.
That's fantastic. Well, we're glad that you're here. And Patrick, do you want us to call you Pat or Patrick on this conversation?
Pat is fine.
All right.
Afio mai, talofa, fa'afe tai lafa, in my own native tongue, Samoan. Welcome, and I thank you for having me. Much to the dismay of probably every employer that I've had, I am kind of directed and instructed by my own kind of cultural precept. And so one of the first things I tell anyone I'm working for is, I don't need a mission statement. I know exactly what I'm doing. Now I'm going to do it on your behalf, but I am really motivated by the own precept of what we would call in Hawaii kuleana, and that is responsibility. And so this was the gift that was provided to me, that we all have a space and a role to play. Titles are not important. So regardless of where you are in your career or how you want to serve, there is always a space and niche for you. And that is how I'm called to this work.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love it. And the fact that you've all come to it in similar but different ways, it's just serves as a demonstration of the diversity of the preservation field. And so now that you've landed in these roles, what's the priority for you and your organization for protecting the planet so that all living things can thrive in the natural world? What are your priorities right now?
I'll go first, just so we can take turns going first. For me, I always say the extension of sovereignty is the work. And really, in large part, if you look at that legal affectation, the ability of tribes to self-govern, self-determine, and really represent themselves on the government-to-government relationship was a critical feature that I think some on the outside might underplay on why the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition was a success. But it really elevates them over and above I don't want to say ordinary nonprofits, but it is certainly a feature that makes a broad kind of feature that separates them from other nonprofits. And so I would say the ability to exercise their sovereignty.
Excellent. Next, who is willing to share their priorities in terms of our theme for Earth Day and National Park Week?
Yeah, I'll go next if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So our priorities year round, but are that much more amplified on Earth Day and National Parks Week, is really to ensure that folks of color are given their rightful place as part of leadership to sustain and maintain our planet. We know that we're on the brink of climate disaster, and that communities of color are most impacted by climate change, and by extension will be the most impacted by climate disaster. And therefore, we are in a unique position as communities of color, as people of color, to know deeply the solutions that are needed to bring us back from that brink. And so our priorities at Justice Outside are really about ensuring that the leadership of people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, communities of color, is seen for what it is, a vital and necessary part to ensure the sustainability of our planet, and that conservation needs to be inclusive of people. For so long, we've had a narrative that conservation is about pristine wilderness, and it removes people from that narrative. And we really need to have people, because we're the ones doing the damage, which means that we also have to be the ones doing the things to fix the planet. And so our priorities are really around communities of color being engaged and given their rightful leadership, and ensuring that people are seen as necessary to the conservation movement.
Go ahead and preach, Rena.
I was going to say, this is the amen section over here. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Because I'm about to get baptized.
I think we all are, Pat.
Can I just say ditto? But really, Rena, what you were saying, what I wanted to share about the Conservancy's priorities is, Rock Creek Park was it was the third federally protected park in the United States. It was the first urban national park. And I think that idea of as our world becomes more and more urbanized, the notion of having wilderness that is in our cities is incredibly important. And the work we're doing is very much place-based, but I think it's a model for the way in which we can think about what a city should be and the access to green space that all people deserve. We need it nearby, not just out there, wherever we happen to be. So.
Can I just add to what Rena kind of started on?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Is that, when I approach this, and, we're always trying to talk about this. And the first thing I would say is, I think all of us try to do this in a way that we are not subtracting. This is a completely additive process. Whatever your mission or objective, we will help you and assist in adding another patina. And the reason behind this is, first, historical attribution and acknowledgement. What has history done, and what can we garner from these lessons of history, especially in the conservation space? So that's number one. The second part is inherently pragmatic. 99% of public lands are west of the Mississippi. So in the work I do of Indian country, that means most of these times you are dealing either directly with the tribe or within their ceded lands. The other subcomponent of that is what we all know and what all empirical evidence clearly illustrates is BIPOC communities are most affected by environmental degradation as well as climate change. Despite that, I'll just give you a quick factoid. There's about $5 billion on the street right now. What we know about BIPOC communities, that's about 40% of the population. BIPOC conservation groups get less than 2% of all these dollars. Think about that. My organization is, about 3 million, which means we already take about 10% of the dollars. So there's an incredible disparity in the funding, despite a clear primacy that we should be a primary integer to the calculus of decision making and problem solving.
So that is a fantastic segue, Pat, to what the America the Beautiful Challenge is all about that was launched by the Biden administration just last week. As you so aptly stated, I think it's a beautiful quote, just adding that extra patina to the work that's going on. And just for folks who are going to be watching this video, I just kind of want to quickly define what the America the Beautiful Challenge is. And so really what the administration has done is they've created an opportunity for grant funding to be streamlined from federal agencies and private philanthropy for conservation projects. And a lot of that work is also highlighted in communities where the Native American communities. And so they're setting up $1 billion over 5 years. That's approximately over $440 million over 5 years to support conservation and restoration projects implemented at the community level in collaborative ways. And they have a particular interest in Indigenous communities. And so that being said, the America the Beautiful Challenge is also going to be propped up by Biden's Justice 40 initiative. Are you guys familiar with that as well? Yeah. And so the Justice 40 initiative is an executive order that he signed immediately after assuming office. And it's an effort to ensure that 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy flow into communities that need it most. So as we talk about strategic alliances and the value that they bring, this is an awesome way to rally your collaborations and your alliances. So will you guys be participating in America the Beautiful Challenge? Are you going to be rallying your alliances in certain ways in the program? Would love to know how. And in case you're not, what else are you going to be doing to make the planet and those public green spaces better? Anybody?
Well, I'll take my turn to go first on this one. And so one of the things that is so interesting, and there are so many great things coming out in terms of conservation that are happening, as you mentioned, America the Beautiful, Justice 40, and 30 by 30, which is another initiative, and they often all three are working in conjunction with each other. But one of the things that we keep insisting on as we continue to participate in collaborations on all three levels that I just named is the importance and the value of an intersectional approach to conservation. So when we rally our communities and we think about strategic collaborations, we're thinking strategy in terms of intersectionality, right? That it's not enough to just get the strictly conservation organizations rallied as part of these movements, that it's not enough to say, oh, you protect trees, wonderful, come on board. Oh, you protect children, that's not what we're focusing on, right? That we have to think about these things as intersectional and interwoven, right? So when we rally our communities and our conservation organizations, and this is true across so many BIPOC-led organizations, is that they already are taking an intersectional approach, because in the words of Audre Lorde, there is no such thing as a single issue life, right? That we have to think about issues as interconnected, woven, and impacting conservation efforts, right? We have a wonderful grantee, the August Research Institute, who is doing work on ocean impact. So they're measuring ocean impact, but they're also building a workforce, a vocational program to be able to fly drones and collect data via drones on ocean impact and ocean degradation. And that intersects not only in workforce development, it also intersects with education and ocean conservation, right? This is an organization that's being led by a Black woman scientist, which is also often underfunded, to your point, Pat, right? So when we think about rallying and being strategic with our collaborations, we have to be willing to look past some of the kind of traditional and legacy organizations that are known in conservation and say, what is happening on the ground in communities of color that are taking that intersectional approach, and how can we apply it to conservation efforts so that all of our edicts get met?
Excellent. Excellent. Anyone else want to talk about what some of those collaboration efforts look like in America the Beautiful?
I would say, and I want to make a comment that these are wonderful initiatives and efforts. And, the Bears Ears is an incredible model of both innovation and how you kind of create this intersectionality with unconventional partners at times. We are completely funded by philanthropy. Our major partners are conservation groups, and then we also have another tier of outdoor retailers, but it is instructed by tribal leadership on all the major kinds of questions. Now, that said, we are very fortunate. We are part of what I would call the conservation zeitgeist, and I'm part of that vernacular. And so when we think about this, we have the privilege of being able to talk to funders directly. That is not the case for the wide kind of spectrum of BIPOC organizations. And too often, and I will make a fairly blunt critique of this, if you're a large conservation group, one of the the top 10, and say you have a 3-letter acronym which will go unnamed, you are on our backs. You are utilizing our communities to get incredibly large amounts of funding that are not 7 or 8 figures, that are in the 9 figures annually, and you use us as a proxy before you even speak to us. So this has to stop. One is there is no clear deliberation. We are being kind of marginalized, even though we're a benefactor. But my point to this is, if you want to have real integration, these conversations would happen beforehand, or you would directly provide these dollars to BIPOC organizations instead of organizations, because they have institutional apparatus and capacity, which seem to be the primary driver to get large dollars. So let's kind of, at times, feature this dominant paradigm and look to really how we can embolden and provide real autonomy to those organizations that actually work in these communities and on the ground.
Excellent. I have some follow-up questions, but I want Jeannie to get in here about whether or not she thinks the Conservancy should participate in what I call the ABC challenge for short, the America the Beautiful challenge.
You like ABCs. Can I comment on what Pat just said a little bit?
Absolutely, please. Yes, let's keep it going.
Yeah, I just want to note that, the Conservancy, I guess we do a 3-letter acronym. We're a tiny little organization.
Not you guys.
Well, but I think it's something that we're very attentive to as a white-led organization, and historically, we do participate in the Green 2.0 scorecard. So I can say we're more diverse than the field as a whole, but probably not where we want to be and where we should be. And we try to be as intentional as possible in thinking about, when it's important for us to get out of the way, how we can build collaborations. But it's helpful to hear your perspective and think about how we can always do better and have those voices really, really leading the charge. We certainly, Chrystal, to answer your question, we certainly hope that and believe that the real impact that's needed to protect Rock Creek, which is it's the heart and the lungs and the soul of Washington, D.C., and a really important carbon sink for our region, an important source of resilience locally and just health benefits as well, would really benefit and align with America the Beautiful. And there's been some really exciting work being done throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed to really identify projects that fit those needs. And one of the things that I've been really excited about is we're talking to our partners at the National Park Service about the sorts of restoration and recreational access work that we can do. Is they're really open in a way that frankly was novel and surprising to me, but delightful, to help to thinking about how we can, as we think about going from 10 acres of restoration a year to like 3,000 throughout the park, including as a criterion how you can make more equitable the sharing of the ecosystem benefits of the park. So not just the biodiversity or other natural resource criteria, which is a really exciting opportunity, and one where we'll need those voices to be helping us set those parameters, right?
So going back to those voices, you all, I think Raina, you mentioned it, the being intersectional, being intentional about intersectionality. But what are some of the barriers to what are some of the barriers to that effort with regard to your strategic alliance? So for example, like you said, you're used to the folks who are always planting the trees or always doing those things, but you want to be sure to include audiences who may not necessarily understand, why stewardship is so important. And so I'd be interested to know, what are some of the barriers that you all have for intersectionality, and how does that bubble up in your alliances to get your work done?
Yeah, I hate to take up more space and go first again, but I want to acknowledge that, we often hear this narrative that communities of color in particular maybe don't understand the importance of conservation, but communities of color have been doing conservation, have been stewards of this planet since time immemorial, right? Like the communities of color, people of color have been connected to the land, are connected to the land. And in instances in which they have not been connected to the land, it's because they've been forcibly removed from that relationship, that it's not a choice for communities of color. And so when I think of barriers, I think that, Pat, you mentioned earlier that there's a very real history of experiences that communities of color face, from trauma around enslavement and genocide to the modern day traumas of immigration policy and abusive laborers without immigration status, right? And so I think that one of the greatest barriers we experience in relationship to intersectionality and taking an intersectional approach is a racial reckoning that, if I can use the language of Tima Akun and Kenneth Jones, in which white conservation needs to have a racial reckoning, and there needs to be a redistribution of power and a willingness to give up that power, either in regards to financial power for these big conservation organizations get the multi-millions, and ceding that power to Black and Brown led efforts that are often overlooked, and a racial reckoning from philanthropy about the role that philanthropy has played in this inequitable power imbalance, both in finance but also in relationship to what is recognized as conservation. Because my grandma reusing the butter container was recycling before recycling was a big deal for conservation, right? Like those things have been happening in communities of color because we have been the innovators by necessity. And so there really does need to be a recognition and a reckoning that happens across the sector of philanthropy and conservation and environment, in order to kind of give the flowers while we're here to accept them and to take those and move the projects forward.
Any other any other barriers in terms of intersectionality?
Yeah, I would comment on, and this is to Rena's point, is that, so, the large elephant in the room, if you don't work in this space intimately, is funders fund funders. Unless you are part of that dynamic, you know what you are? You're a little kid sitting in the den at Thanksgiving and you're not at the main dining room table. You can see everyone, but you got the janky table that someone put a plastic red checkered, because I sat at that table till like age 29.
I was going to
Like,
say, how do you know about my family's table traditions?
and you got to put like a paper bag so the table's all wobbly and whatnot. And so here you are as an adult, right? And you're peering at the big person table. And that's what conservation is. You're allowed in the room, you're allowed to nibble around the perimeter, but you're not part of the critical mass of that actual kind of autonomy that these people have. And so, to Rena's point, this has to be disassembled. And as I, mentioned in the beginning, for pragmatism, I guarantee you, if you allow BIPOC communities and the ones most affected in these different spaces like environmental degradation and climate change, you will have a much better productivity of yield of your specific objective and mission. I guarantee it. And if you don't, in the next 10 years, I guarantee this, you'll be obsolete. So I think there are some just really practical reasons that we need to revisit this. But also, the realization is not everyone is afforded these kinds of conversations and audiences to directly speak to the things that we have on our mind.
Excellent.
On top of all those sort of individual but also institutional barriers, we're also thinking a lot about the structural barriers that exist, to leverage things like the America the Beautiful and some of these other really big funding streams that are out there. If you look at what's on the National Register, which, creates eligibility in many cases for different funding opportunities, the resources that are historically associated with, the whole story of a park or a protected land aren't always listed on the register because they weren't always considered as significant as those that represent the dominant culture in an area. We see this in Rock Creek Park with the Carter Barron Amphitheater, which is a really important part of our nation's history, and also it's a gateway to the park and really important to the local community, right? And it's not recognized in the same way that, like, I'm not going to name another resource in Rock Creek Park, but another resource somewhere else in the Park Service might be, and there's not that understanding. So as not just we as potential consumers of these funds, but as the agencies are thinking about how, and the legislators are thinking about how these funds will be distributed, I think it's really important to think about how you can fit these square pegs into round holes that have been created by years and years of power imbalances in those federal processes, which, as we all know, are slow to shift.
So let's talk about the mechanics of that for a second. So, you mentioned the trying to fit that square peg in this round hole, and there might be some folks who'll watch this later and they are trying to build out these strategic alliances and they want to work collaboratively. Let's talk for a second about the mechanics of your collaborations. So, what how are you governing your collabs? Are you a formal body? Are you an informal body? Pat mentioned that they seem to be funder driven in their coalition. Is there shared leadership? I'd love to know a little bit about the mechanics for how you all overcome these barriers and how you solve for problems and things like that. I'm really curious to understand that.
I'll go first this time. One of the first things that I had to make a realization of and be really cognizant about was the funding world. It was not something that really was of my kind of past experience. And so fortunately, we have a variety of funders. One of our major funders is the Hewlett Foundation, and I have a fantastic program officer named Andrea there. And
Yes.
about in the middle of this, I went to Andrea and said, development work is not something that I have a great expertise. And I need you to open these doors, to allow conversations to occur, to introduce myself. I will carry it out from there, but this is not the circle in which I have a natural Rolodex. And by taking that step back and, actually being somewhat vulnerable to say, this is an area that I'm exposed and I need some sophistication. I need some expertise. I need some introductions. It really allowed me to tell the story in an authentic way about the Bears ears. And I have to give credit that she openly opened these doors, but it was really unveiling the wizard behind everything. And, you know, I guess what I'm suggesting is, for us as a BIPOC community, and especially if you're in a leadership position, whether a CEO or an ED, you're not an expert at everything. And you have to rely on parties to introduce you to widen the circle of relationships. And so I bring that up because one, it's fairly kind of profound in what that yield back to us, but also as a kind of a lesson that we all need to have some humility in what we're doing, because we're not going to have the answers on ready all the time.
And so you are so is there shared leadership then in your coalition, Pat?
Yeah, I mean, our coalition is led by 5 tribal leaders from the 5 tribes. So those tribes are Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, Ute, and Ute Mountain. But within those tribes, you have Pueblo tribes, you have large reservation land tribes, Navajo being the largest in the nation, as well as Ute is very large. But also, what you're dealing with is a real kind of distinction in the level of capacity and infrastructure relative to each tribe. So even in what I'm doing, I'm trying to create equity and parity on the platform on how they govern, because it would be easy for a tribe to, like Navajo, to consume the dialogue of a smaller tribe. And so even within my community, I have to make these kind of very intentional types of, oh, um, um, processes so that everyone has an equal and fair voice into the decision making. Does that answer your question?
Oh, absolutely. This is kind of the meat that I want to get into. And so, Jeannie, how is your alliance governed? Are you a formal or informal body? Is there shared leadership, funder driven, pros and cons of your structure? Any of those things would be awesome to know.
Well, we have a few different sort of lenses on which we collaborate. One of the things that makes the Rock Creek Conservancy a little bit unique is that we work in DC and Montgomery County, but just in the Rock Creek watershed. So we're working on this sort of slice of these 2 jurisdictions, which are also in 2 different states. So in a lot of places, we're sort of the glue that holds those 2 pieces together. But we're not the only organization, and it's helpful to align with organizations that are working across those jurisdictions, particularly on our watershed issues. And we actually just created a formal structure for a watershed group, the Stormwater Partners Network in Montgomery County. That's all the watershed groups and similarly aligned organizations. So some are civic associations, some are community groups. And Pat, we have what sounds like a really similar challenge in that some are, have staff like myself and my co-chair of the network. And then we have groups that are just groups of volunteers who they have a formal governance structure, but their budget is, $50 a year, and they bring very different. And sometimes the hardest part is just finding a time to meet that, doesn't disrupt childcare schedules and, sort of preferences and modalities, if you will. And then the inevitable Teams versus Zoom issue that I think all alliances are dealing with at this stage in our development. And then we do have a very formal relationship with the National Park Service as a partnership. And I think that's our kind of the crux of the work that we do, being able to have that formal philanthropic partnership agreement that allows us to work together and collaborate, but also hold each other to account when it's time.
So you've got several alliances that you're working in for specific needs, and I think that's fantastic because there can't be a one size fits all. And Raina, I'm curious about, Justice Outside. Again, are you formal, informal? Is there shared leadership? Are you structured by funder? Some of your pros and cons, all of those things. I'd love to know.
Yeah, thank you. So we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're an intermediary grant maker, and we consider ourselves a change maker at the systems level. And so, excuse me, our work is really, when we think about our alliances, our collaborations, our coalitions, we see ourselves as a network weaver. And so we really lean into building authentic relationships across the environmental sector. And so relationships with larger foundations and funders that are looking to redistribute power in the form of wealth, right? And as an intermediary, we have a priority that our grant making prioritizes Black, Indigenous, and people of color led outdoor and environmental organizations. And then when we think about what it means to fund a nonprofit, to fund and work with community of color led activities, we don't just stop at financial support, right? We look at financial support as necessary for sure, but we also say, and what more can we do? Can we introduce you to other funders? Can we support you in building up your organization's capacity? And what does that look like? We work really hard to move against the kind of very common pitfalls of traditional funders that lean into dictating where money should go, how it's spent, who's eligible for that money. So we don't require 501 status or fiscal sponsorship for our grantees. I have been very fortunate to be the first funding stream for several organizations across the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest that are being led by dynamic women of color. And so we really see our work as being able to sit in the center of philanthropy and in the center of nonprofit environmental work and say there's somehow a miscommunication that's happening and it's not serving any of us. So how can we build those bridges of communication? And when the time is right, remove ourselves from that relationship because we've ensured that it is strong and authentic on all parts. And those power dynamics are being equalized and no longer working against everybody's best efforts.
So Jeannie and Pat, you heard that Raina has access to funds, right? I'm just putting that out there. And much of the work that you all are doing, but Raina, I'll leave that up to you. So that's interesting to know. So two sound like they're really funder driven and relationship driven. And Jeannie, you sound like more like it's more community driven, collaboration driven, except for the very formal partnership that you have with NPS. And so with all of that said, you have this grantor point of view, and then you have kind of this community point of view. How are you all measuring the productivity and impact within your collaborations on the work that you do? Or are you measuring?
Are you sure you don't work for a funder? That sounds like a very funder-oriented question. So I'll say is we actually develop our impact with our grantees. So we work with a ton of great philanthropic organizations that are providing the intermediary funds to be able to redistribute that wealth. But we don't start our relationship with them dictating what they'd like the impact to be. We have a candid conversation that the impact is really going to be driven by those on the ground. So for us to set impact reporting stipulations or to dictate what impact we want to see is not us taking the lead from the people who are best positioned on the ground to lead the solutions and understand most holistically what that impact is going to be. So our impact reporting is really developed in relationship with our grantees, and we're very fortunate to work with other funders that are trusting us and leaning into that model so that the impact we're reporting back to them is really from the ground up rather than dictated from top down.
Yeah, kind of touching on what Rena said is that I think, funders are getting into a much better space and really kind of extending confidence. To a certain extent, if you think about it, and if we just go back a short time ago, like 3-4 years ago, the metrics that a lot of funders that would put out there, to me, it's like Snoopy's blanket. They're just for their confidence. It does nothing for me. This is like your whoopee. And unless you can provide why the analytics relative to metrics really benefit me, I don't know what the hell you're doing, because too often they try to create one that has a universal portable application. And if you're working in the conservation space with the full kind of robustness of different groups and sizes, it just doesn't work. And especially if you don't add with that an explanation and technical assistance, because most of the organizations are 10 people or less. And now you've created this reporting requirement that you need like 3 FTEs just to complete. But I will kind of digress and say, folks have gotten a lot better. We operate, and the funders that we, have associations with, really from a qualitative approach. And for us, it was a 2-prong. Full restoration of the monument. We did that. It culminated at the White House in October. And then 2, the completion of a 2 million acre land management plan that would then be interfaced with the respective federal agencies, that being BLM and the U.S. Forest Service. And we're about 10 days from completing that. So in terms of the major checkoffs, it's check, check.
Excellent, excellent.
Well,
Jeannie.
that gives me hope, Pat, because I think one of the challenges with talking about impact is it's nonlinear, right? These things, building authentic relationships, but also restoring natural take time. And the investments we're making now will bear fruit in the future, hopefully in a nonlinear way. So, Pat, for in the space of 6 months to restore the monument and then launch that plan is remarkable, but I know it's many, many years in the making, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And I like to think that we're laying the groundwork now for hopefully some big, ambitious, restoring the entire forests of Rock Creek Park in a way that's really community driven and equitable. But that's a multi-year process, right? So we need people who are willing to be patient with us now, and funders while we do that hard work.
Yeah.
So it's nice to see some success on the other side of things.
The nature of the work, and you guys all know this, is that you're going to have some kind of inflection point, a crucible of all things you believe and whether you can go forward, which is, I think the primary cause of day drinking, at least in my situation. But it's the nature of the beast. There are going to be points where you're just like, is this going to get done? Did we just waste 2-3 years? But it is also, from the communities that at least I come from, it is the kind of internal constitution and comportment to like, tomorrow's a new day, and we will keep on going forward. And so there's a confidence in not just your relationships, but a confidence that, the timeline is not a Western standard. And if I don't complete it in this particular, Q3, I will complete it at some point. And so I think, at times to have a different sensibility placed on this, can be healthy and productive.
That's a really interesting point about culturally, in terms of time and time management and all of those things. And I think, Pat, you also mentioned something really interesting that I'd love to learn more about from the three of you. And is when you're talking about impact and you're talking about some cultural relevancies, I'd love to know about, if you are providing technical assistance, what does that look like for you, particularly given the communities that you serve? And, has it been helpful to them, or have you found that you're coming in with a certain bias, if you will, and so the technical assistance support that you want to provide isn't necessarily the kind of help that they need?
Yeah, that's a great question. In our situation, we first had a strategy that we would collectively create this land management plan. But for the very reasons that you alluded to, one, tribes are not monolithic, and
Right.
to think otherwise is to meander through Tropeville. Um, and so what we did is we specifically said each tribe should identify the things that they think are most important, develop their own priorities, and we will equitably give each of their tribes technical assistance dollars. And you can even contract to whoever you want instead of having a single contractor for 5 different tribes. Now, was it more bureaucracy and more work to, um, get all of these contracts out, because these were 6 and 7 figure contracts? Yes, but the end product, again, is going towards this notion of, let's be qualitative about this. Let's not worry that it hasn't been done or this is not the usual practice. I think one of the laziest things that are out there is the utilization and the vernacular of best practices. Best practices means I haven't thought about it, so I'm going to go to Joe down the street and just use whatever he does and somehow, through sheer brute strength, force it on my organization. These are your problems, and you should create something that is in alignment to the idiosyncratic institutionality of your organization, not some best practice that you've read on an airport in Cleveland on the Harvard Business Review.
Now it's my turn to say, preach, Dr. Gonzalez. Oh, wow. Anybody else want to join that conversation about technical assistance?
Yeah, I'll just add one. I appreciated that you said don't go to Joe down the street, because my fiance's name is Joe, and he is a 6'3" Jewish white man. So whatever is working for him in the world is not going to work for me and all my 5' nothing Latina-ness, right? So it's a very clear parallel in my mind. So thank you for that, Pat. But also I'll just say, we don't do anything at Justice Outside without first talking to the community we're hoping to engage with, right? It would be backwards for us to say, grantees, we are going to give you this, as if we are bestowing on them some great honor to have an opportunity, right? Like that is not being in good and right relationship with our community, because relationship requires a back and forth. And it often requires the person who has the most power in the relationship to step back and say, what power am I going to cede for the health of this relationship? Right. And so we don't do anything without first saying, here's the opportunity we have to redistribute whatever resources we have. How would you like to see us redistribute that? And so for our grantees, that means that we ask them very specifically, what technical assistance or supports would you like to see to strengthen your organization? We also offer general operating money. So whenever we give folks money, it's without strings that would hinder their ability to do the work that they need to do, right? And this all is rooted in this true belief that trust is going to be what pulls us back from the brink, right? That if we put stipulations and strings around everything, from how people can spend money or who they can hire as a consultant, then we're not trusting them to know authentically what they need. And it's very patronizing to be on the receiving end when you know that the trust isn't there. And so we lean really, really heavily into saying, what can we provide? Not here's all the things we can provide, take it, but this is what we can provide. Do you want any of these things? Or can we radically re-envision what these things could look like if they're not working for you? Right. And it takes more time on our part. And like I said, that's the work of people in positions of power who want to be in relationship and allyship with those that have been disenfranchised from these systems. Our work should be greater. It should take us more time to do things right when we are taking our cues from those on the ground doing the work.
This is so excellent. This is awesome. Jeannie, do you have anything to add about technical assistance?
I'll just say a hearty ditto.
Excellent, excellent. Wow, I know we're getting close. So before we wrap up, but I'd love to ask you one more question as we close in celebration for Earth Day and National Park Week. So if you had to choose to be an earth element, which one would it be and why? So would you choose to be earth, wind, fire, or water?
Oh, it's easy for me.
Yeah?
If I'm water, at some point I'm going to be part of someone's cocktail. that is the most organic cradle to grave experience there is.
This is true, and we need water to survive. So whether it's by itself or mixed with something, you got it. Anybody else?
I really appreciate that. I will say Earth, Wind, and Fire have put out some of my all-time favorite songs.
Yeah.
So it's really hard to try and separate them. But I'll go with Fire, in part because fire is the tool that has allowed humanity to evolve. And so if we can just figure out how to harness that tool to reverse the negative impacts and at times to burn it all down when it needs to be burned all down, because not all systems need to be reformed. Some of them just need to be burnt down. Then I'll be that tool too, right?
And Jeannie.
Guess I'll go with the earth to be not just to be different, but also just that really strong, solid foundation resonates with me. Feeling rooted.
This has been great. I know personally I have got some great quotes to tweet out from this conversation, and I'll tag you all if you're on Twitter. But I just want to thank you for a wonderfully engaging conversation. I appreciate your time, and I wish you continued success in your role. And for the viewers who will be watching this, please visit my guests' websites for more information about their work, and then follow them on their social media platforms. And finally, a shameless plug for me, since I am Onyx Strategies Group. If you're looking to expand your sphere of influence through strategic partnerships and collaborations, we can help. So give us a call or go on our website at www.onyxstrategiesgroup.com for more information. That will do it for us today, and I'll see you in a month for the next Onyx Strategies Group conversation. And now I'll end the recording.